You ever have one of those weeks where everything seems calm, right before the storm hits? That was me. My name's Jack Monroe, owner of Monroe Demolition Services. 20 years in the business, tearing down buildings, bridges, even old factories. You name it, I've leveled it. But nothing prepared me for the day the HOA decided to build 28 luxury condos. Right on my land. Yeah, my land. It started one Monday morning. I was sipping coffee on the porch of my ranch property, sun shining over the acres I worked my whole life to own. Then I heard it. The distant hum of machinery. Bulldozers, concrete mixers, construction noise echoing across my valley. At first, I thought it was a new project on the next block. But the sound, it was too close. Way too close. I drove out toward the sound, dust flying behind my truck, and when I turned the corner of my own fence line, my jaw dropped. There were workers, blueprints, and bright orange safety vests all over my land. Huge banners reading HOA Residential Expansion Project. My logo was still on the gate post, and yet here they were, drilling, digging, and pouring foundation like they owned the place. I stepped out of the truck, heart pounding. The foreman looked up, clipboard in hand, and said, "Morning, sir, you here for inspection?" I said, "Inspection? I own this property." He laughed, thought I was joking. He pointed toward a woman in a suit, standing near the temporary office trailer. "You'll want to talk to her. That's Karen, HOA president." And that's when I met her. She had that confident smirk, sunglasses reflecting the rising sun, clipboard under her arm like it was a weapon. I asked her what was going on. She said, "Oh, Mr. Monroe, this parcel has been rezoned. We've already filed everything with the HOA Development Board. You'll be compensated once the condos sell." I just stared at her. Compensated? My land wasn't for sale. Never had been. My father's ashes were buried on that hill. It wasn't just property, it was my legacy. And this woman was talking about it like it was some real estate flip. I said, "Ma'am, I never sold anything. You're trespassing." She smiled like I was a child. "Oh, we've got everything approved by city council. It's too late to stop now." Then she turned away, yelling orders to her crew. Just like that. Like I didn't exist. Like my ownership meant nothing. I walked back to my truck shaking my head. It wasn't anger yet. It was disbelief. Because in my mind I was thinking maybe there was a mistake. Some paperwork issue, some confusion in records. But deep down I knew. I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was an HOA land grab. That night I pulled every document I had. Land deeds, titles, surveys, contracts. All of it. Everything proved this was my property. Legally. Officially. Completely. The HOA had built without a single signature from me. They forged some approval or got some insider to stamp it fast. The next morning I drove to the HOA office. Clean glass doors, fake smiles, everyone sipping lattes behind a desk. Karen was there again in her blazer talking to some investors. I walked straight to her and dropped the deed folder on her desk. "This," I said, "is my land. You've got 72 hours to clear every machine off it." She looked at me like I was telling a joke. "You can't just demand that, Mr. Monroe. We've already poured foundation. You'll be compensated after Phase 1. I leaned in closer. Phase 1 ends in 72 hours. After that, anything still standing comes down. She laughed. "Are you threatening us?" I smiled back. "No, ma'am. That's a promise." I walked out, slow, steady, while every eye in the lobby followed me. That night, she sent her little team of HOA lawyers to my house. They came waving papers talking about lawsuits, construction delays, financial penalties. But I'd been around long enough to know how this game works. Those papers meant nothing without a court order. 3 days passed. They didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Trucks came in and out, cranes lifted steel beams, and the condos started rising from the ground. Every day, the sound of hammers echoed across my property like mockery. But I was patient. Patient, and planning. See, when you run a demolition company, you learn one thing. Nothing built without a foundation of respect will ever stand for long. So I made some calls. Gathered my crew. 12 men I trusted like brothers. Each one had been with me for years. And I told them, "Boys, this Saturday we're taking back what's ours." They laughed, thought I was half joking. I wasn't. Saturday morning came. The HOA had a ribbon-cutting ceremony planned. Balloons, champagne, real estate agents, buyers. The whole fake celebration. Karen was front and center with a microphone, giving her speech about community growth and modern living. The crowd clapped. Cameras flashed. And then the sound changed. The champagne corks popped, but behind them, a different sound rumbled in the distance. Engines. Heavy. Loud. Unstoppable. Karen paused mid-speech looking confused. People turned their heads toward the road. And there, rising over the hill, came 6 of my company's demolition bulldozers, yellow, massive, moving in perfect formation. The earth itself seemed to shake as they rolled in. My truck led the line. The crowd's clapping stopped. Karen shouted something to security, waving her arms. But security didn't move. They knew exactly who I was. I parked the truck right at the site entrance, stepped out wearing my work boots and jacket with Monroe Demolition stitched on the chest. My men followed behind me, helmets on, eyes steady. Karen stomped over, furious. "What do you think you're doing?" I said, "You've had your 72 hours. She screamed about police, about lawsuits, about everything except the truth. I didn't flinch. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "This is my land. You built without permission. You ignored warnings. Now I'm removing your mess." She called my bluff. "You wouldn't dare." I smiled. "Ma'am, daring is my business." I turned to my crew and gave one signal, just a nod. Engines roared. Dirt flew. The first condo wall trembled as the steel blade hit concrete. The crowd screamed. Dust clouds rose. Karen stood frozen, screaming orders nobody followed. The first building came down in 30 seconds flat. Then the second. Then the third. One by one, the illegal condos collapsed like dominoes. People were filming, shouting, running. HOA members were crying. Karen stood there helpless as her grand project crumbled to rubble right before her eyes. When the dust finally settled, I walked over to her. "Come. Steady." I handed her the property deed again, the same one she ignored. "This," I said, "is what ownership looks like." She couldn't speak. Her perfect speech papers fluttered out of her hands into the dirt. I turned and walked away, the sun shining through the dust, my men behind me, engines still humming low. That day the HOA learned a lesson they'd never forget. You don't build on someone else's land and expect it to stand. And that was just the beginning. Because what came next made the whole town take sides. Some saw me as a hero. Others called me reckless. But one thing was clear: nobody messed with Jack Monroe again. The sun was still hanging low when the last condo came crashing down. Dust clouds rolled through the air like ghosts of what once stood. The crowd had scattered. Reporters were already gathering by the street. And in the middle of all that noise, I stood calm, watching the rubble settle into silence. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. The fight was over, at least for me. But for Karen it had just begun. Within an hour, police sirens filled the air. 3 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing red and blue against the broken concrete. An officer stepped out, hand on his belt, looking at the wreckage, then at me. "Sir," he said, "are you the one responsible for this?" I nodded. "Yes, sir. Name's Jack Monroe. This is my land and I've got the deed right here." He took a deep breath, looked over the papers, then radioed something in. A few moments later, his tone softened. "Everything seems legal, but we'll need statements." Karen was screaming from across the site, covered in dust, voice hoarse from shouting. "Arrest him. He destroyed HOA property." The officer turned to her and said calmly, "Ma'am, according to this record, this isn't HOA property. It's everything built here was unauthorized." Her jaw fell open. "That's impossible. We had permits." The officer looked at me again. "You got any proof of notice?" I said, 3 written warnings, hand-delivered, all signed by HOA staff." He nodded. "All right then. Looks like this is going to be more of a civil matter." Karen's face turned bright red. She started yelling again, pointing at me like I'd just blown up the White House. The cameras loved it. Reporters filmed every word. That night, the footage spread across social media like wildfire. Local man demolishes HOA project on his own property. Some called me a hero. Others called me insane. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was the boldest thing they'd ever seen. 2 days later, I woke up to reporters parked outside my gate. They wanted interviews. They wanted drama. But I stayed quiet. Let the story speak for itself. My lawyer advised me to stay off the record, and I did, for a while. Then the lawsuit came. Karen and her HOA filed a $30 million claim against me for destruction of property, emotional distress, and public humiliation. $30 million. I laughed when I saw the number. My lawyer didn't. He said, "Jack, this could get messy. You sure you want to fight this?" I said, "No. I don't want to fight. I want to win." So we started digging. Not with bulldozers this time, with paperwork. Turned out the HOA had been playing dirty for years. Illegal zoning approvals, false signatures, even bribing one of the city permit officers to fast-track construction. My land wasn't the first they tried to take. It was just the first one they picked to fight with the wrong man over. We built a case so solid that when our evidence hit the court, their lawyer's face went white. Every email, every fake permit, every check they cashed under the table, it was all there. The judge didn't even need a full hearing. She looked over the files and said, "This HOA acted without authority. Case dismissed. Property rights restored to Mr. Monroe." Karen tried to argue, but the judge cut her off. "Ma'am, not only is your HOA responsible for unauthorized construction, but you also trespassed on private property. You should be thankful no criminal charges are filed." The room went dead silent. Karen just stood there, trembling, her entire plan collapsing right in front of her. When we walked out of that courthouse, my lawyer clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You just made history, Jack." I said, "No. I just defended what was mine." But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. She tried to turn the neighborhood against me. Flyers, meetings, petitions, she told everyone I was dangerous, that I destroyed homes and didn't care about the community. Some neighbors avoided me after that. Others came by to shake my hand, saying I did what they'd always wanted to do, stand up to her. A week later I got a notice. HOA members wanted to hold an emergency vote to remove Karen as president. They'd finally had enough. The night of the vote, the community hall was packed. I didn't plan on attending, but something told me I should. When I walked in, everyone went silent. Karen was at the front, trying to talk over the noise. She spotted me and froze. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the back while the members took turns speaking. An old man stood up and said, "Karen, you promised us safety and growth. Instead, you gave us chaos." A woman added, "You built condos on land that wasn't even ours. You embarrassed this whole community." The room murmured in agreement. Karen's voice cracked. "I did what I thought was best for progress." Then I stepped forward. Everyone turned to me. I said, "Progress doesn't mean taking what's not yours. It means respecting the people who built this place long before you." She glared at me, but she knew it was over. The vote was unanimous. She was out. I thought that would be the end. But fate had one more twist waiting. 2 months later, one of my workers called me. Said there was movement on the edge of the property again. I drove out, half expecting to see more construction equipment. But this time it wasn't builders, it was inspectors. Government ones. They were surveying the damage, checking soil stability after the demolition. One of them looked up and said, "Mr. Monroe, you know this land sits right over an old underground gas line?" I said, "Yeah, my dad mentioned that years ago." "Why?" He said, "Because if anyone had tried to build heavy structures here, one wrong hit could have caused an explosion big enough to level the whole area." I froze. My hands went cold. Those condos weren't just illegal, they were deadly. If they had finished building, if families had moved in, one small spark could have wiped them all out. I looked out over the flattened ground, sunlight glinting off the steel rebar buried in dust. For the first time since this whole mess began, I realized something. I hadn't just saved my land. I'd probably saved lives. A week later, the local news picked up the inspection results. HOA development project could have ended in disaster. Reporters swarmed again, this time calling me a hero. I didn't feel like one. But when I saw parents walking their kids past my property, smiling and waving, I knew I'd done something right. Karen disappeared after that. Rumor was she sold her house and moved out of state. Couldn't handle the reputation anymore. HOA got new leadership, good people this time. Fair, honest, respectful. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat back on my porch, same spot where it all started. The wind carried the smell of fresh dirt, clean and quiet. My crew had helped clear the last of the rubble, leaving the land open again just like before. My neighbor, old Mr. Tanner, walked over with a cup of coffee. He said, "You know, Jack, I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to that woman. You gave this neighborhood its backbone back." I laughed. "Didn't do it for them, Tanner. I did it for the land." He smiled. "Well, sometimes the land chooses its defender." We sat there watching the sunset, no noise, no chaos, just peace. Later that night, as I locked up my shed, I looked one last time at the open field where those condos once stood. It wasn't just dirt. It was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, no piece of paper, no forged signature, no fake authority can erase what's rightfully yours. I thought back to Karen's face that day, the way her confidence cracked when the bulldozers rolled in. And I smiled. Not out of spite. But because justice, when it finally comes, doesn't need noise. It just needs time. The town moved on. Life went back to normal. But every now and then I'd get a letter in the mail, from people all over the state who'd heard my story. They'd say things like, "Thank you for standing up for property rights," or, "You gave me courage to fight my own HOA." And I'd write back the same thing every time. Stand your ground. Stay calm. Know your worth. Because once you let others build over you, you lose more than land, you lose your voice. That's how I learned the real meaning of ownership. It's not about what you build. It's about what you're willing to protect. Weeks passed. The land was quiet again. No shouting, no reporters, no HOA meetings. For the first time in months, I could hear the wind move through the trees without a single sound of construction in the distance. But peace, as I learned, never lasts long in this town. One cold morning I got a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name printed neatly on the front. I opened it, thinking it was another neighbor thanking me for standing up to Karen's HOA. But this one was different. It wasn't signed and it only had 8 words. "You only flattened the surface, not the truth." For a second I thought it was a prank. But the more I looked at that paper, the more something about it bothered me. The typeface. The way the ink bled slightly like it came from an old printer. Someone wanted me to dig again. And after what I'd been through, I knew better than to ignore warnings. So I started asking questions. My buddy Mark, who used to work in the city zoning department, owed me a favor. I called him and said, "You ever heard anything about that HOA Karen used to run? Something still doesn't sit right." He hesitated. "Jack, between you and me, that HOA had backing from someone high up. Real high. They weren't just building condos. There was talk of a luxury resort project, quietly funded by a development group from out of state." "Who?" I asked. He sighed. "A man named Robert Klein. Big money. He's got friends in city council. I think Karen was just the local face." I leaned back in my chair, the same frustration burning up again. So that's what this was about. It was never just about property lines. It was about greed. A handful of powerful people trying to turn my land into their gold mine. And Karen, she wasn't gone. She was hiding. 2 nights later, I saw headlights outside my gate. A black SUV idling in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out, careful and calm. The window rolled down and there she was. Karen. Sunglasses on even though it was night. Same cold smirk she had the first time we met. "Well, if it isn't the demolition man," she said. I didn't answer. Just watched her. She leaned forward. "You think you've won, Jack? You think knocking down a few condos stopped anything? The people behind this project don't care about your land. They'll just buy everything around it until you're boxed in." I said, "Then I'll knock those down too." Her smirk faded for a second, then came back sharper. "You can't bulldoze influence, Jack. These people have power. The kind that doesn't need to file permits." Before I could reply, she tossed a small folder out the window. It landed at my feet, then she drove off without another word. Inside were copies of documents, emails, permits, contracts, and a list of names. I recognized some of them. City officials, a bank executive, and one familiar name that made my blood run cold. The same permit officer who tried to fast-track her condos. He wasn't just bribed. He was part of the development syndicate. The deeper I read, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't lying this time. The HOA was only a mask for something bigger, a hidden network of land acquisitions disguised as community growth projects. They had plans for the entire county, and my demolition had set their schedule back years. I called Mark again and told him what I found. He said, "Jack, this isn't just a property dispute anymore. You're dealing with corporate fraud. Be careful." But I'd had enough of being careful. They'd come for me once. I wasn't going to wait for them to try again. The next day I went to see the sheriff. A tall man named Cooper, quiet but sharp. He'd heard the stories, watched the videos, and stayed out of the mess while it unfolded. When I showed him the folder, he flipped through the pages slowly, eyes narrowing. "This," he said, "is bigger than I expected. You mind if I hand this to the state investigators?" I nodded. "Do what you have to. But if they're planning another move, I want to know first." He said, "You'll be the first call I make." For the next few weeks, everything seemed calm again. Too calm. Then one night, around midnight, my motion sensors went off. Cameras caught movement near the property line. I pulled up the feed on my phone and saw 3 figures in black clothing cutting through the fence. They were carrying equipment. Not construction tools, surveying gear. I drove out there in my truck, headlights off. When I got close, I hit the lights full beam. The men froze like deer. I stepped out, one hand resting on the side of the truck, voice steady. "Evening, gentlemen. You're a little far from home. One of them turned, clearly nervous. "We're with city development," he said quickly. "Just checking soil stability." "Without permission? At midnight?" I said. They didn't answer. That's when another vehicle appeared down the road. Sheriff Cooper's cruiser. Sirens silent but lights flashing. The men panicked. Two ran. Cooper caught one. The rest disappeared into the dark woods. They weren't city workers. They were hired contractors from Klein's company. Cooper hauled the man into custody and later found equipment in their van. Maps of my property, drone photos, and a letter from Klein's office authorizing a quiet resurvey for reclamation use. They were planning to take it again. Only this time they were going to make it look legal. That was their mistake. Because while they were scheming on paper, I was preparing in the real world. I called my crew, the same demolition team that had stood by me before. And I told them we had one more project. Only this time, it wasn't to destroy anything. It was to reveal something. We spent 3 days digging near the foundation lines where the condos once stood. And on the 4th day we hit something solid. Old storage tanks, rusted, half-buried. We cleared the dirt and realized they were filled with chemicals. Illegal waste, sealed and forgotten decades ago. Someone had built right over them without telling a soul. That's why the developers wanted this land. Not for condos. Not for profit. They wanted to hide the evidence of what was buried beneath. When Cooper saw what we found, he called in state environmental officers immediately. Within 24 hours, the entire site was cordoned off. The chemicals were traced back to an old company that Robert Klein had once owned. They'd dumped industrial waste here years before the town was even founded, and when the land changed hands, the records disappeared. Karen hadn't known about the chemicals at first, but she'd learned later and kept quiet because she'd been promised a piece of the profits if the development went through. The investigation blew up like wildfire. News stations ran the story nonstop. Illegal waste scandal exposed after demolition. My name came up again, but this time it wasn't as a man who destroyed property. It was as the man who uncovered one of the biggest cover-ups in the county's history. Robert Klein was arrested. Several city officials resigned. And Karen, well, she finally turned herself in. Cooper told me she walked into his office one morning, handed him a small notebook and said, "It's all in there." Then she left without saying another word. That notebook had records of every payment she ever received, every meeting she attended, every instruction Klein gave her. She kept it as insurance. And now it was her confession. When the case finally wrapped, the county seized all of Klein's remaining properties. The state declared my land safe but ordered a full cleanup of the waste site, fully paid for by Klein's frozen assets. I watched from my porch as teams came in with hazmat suits, digging deep into the soil, removing every trace of poison left behind. It was strange. The same ground that nearly tore my life apart was now being healed piece by piece. Months later, when the cleanup was done, they returned the deed to me, stamped and certified. My land was clear both legally and literally. That night, I sat by the fire pit with my crew drinking coffee watching the stars. Mark showed up holding a newspaper. "You're a legend now," he said laughing. "They're calling you the man who bulldozed corruption." I smiled. Not a bad title. I'll take it. But deep down I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt grateful. Grateful that the land was safe. Grateful that truth had come out. Grateful that my daughter could grow up knowing her dad didn't bow to greed. A few weeks later, Cooper came by. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from Karen. No threats this time. Just a few lines written in shaky handwriting. "Jack, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could change things, make them better. But I lost myself trying to chase power that was never mine. You were right to stop me. Maybe I'll find peace now. Karen." I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Pity? Maybe both. I folded the letter and set it in the drawer beside my old family photos. Because in the end, that's all it ever was about, what you're willing to protect and what you're willing to let go. Years passed. The land turned green again. Grass grew over the spots where concrete once stood. Birds came back. Life came back. I rebuilt a small barn, turned part of the property into a training ground for demolition apprentices. Taught them the right way to handle power, not to destroy for pride but to rebuild with purpose. Sometimes new faces drive by and stop at the fence. They point to the open field and ask, "Is this where that big demolition happened?" I smile and nod. That's the one. And when they ask why I did it, I just tell them the truth. Because no one gets to steal what you've built. Not the HOA, not the government, not anyone. You stand your ground, or someone else will stand on it for you. As the sun sets, I look out over that land and think about everything that happened. The noise, the lawsuits, the fear, the fight, and finally the peace. It all started with 28 condos. And it ended with a lesson that'll outlast every one of them. Power doesn't come from permits or paper. It comes from conviction. And when the world tries to bury you under lies, sometimes you have to bring in the bulldozers, not to destroy, but to uncover the truth that's been buried too long. That's how it ended. Not with fire. Not with rage. But with clarity. The land stood. The truth stood. And so did I. If you like this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more crazy HOA tales, and don't forget to drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you do in this situation.